Well, welcome back to another episode of Rebuilding the Palisades podcast, hosted by DSI. I'm Giles Sutton, and today we are joined by the illustrious Richard Manion, principal of Richard Manion Architecture. Richard, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, as we love to do with this podcast, we love to sort of dig into really how people got into this business, how people got into this industry. So, I'd love to. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I think there are a couple of big factors in my childhood that may have influenced me. I did not have any relatives in the profession or any connection to the profession. But I do remember fondly building structures out of Legos and Lincoln logs as a child. I'm sure that's not uncommon, especially growing up in the 60s and 70s. And I grew up in New England, and we had a lot of interesting period architecture in my town and where my family lived. And I also remember summer trips, particularly to Newport, Rhode Island, growing up, which was sort of the original Hamptons in a way, and great works of different historical styles on a very grand scale. And fortunately, many were open to the public and tours. And somehow I think a combination of all of that imbued in me the desire to maybe create buildings on some level.
That's wonderful. And what led you to establish your firm?
I always wanted to do my own work. Even when working for others, I always thought of it as kind of the end goal. And I had the good fortune of working in New York in the mid to late 1980s for Robert Stern, who was a pioneer in eclectic historical architecture. And at that time, all of his work was really residential. Mm-hmm. So and my interest in residential work, had already been established in my childhood. So it became a really great background. And I had an uncle in Southern California and had some relatives here. And they said there was a lot of opportunities, so I decided to take the plunge, first working for a firm for a number of years to get my understanding of the area and the region and opportunities, and then eventually a partnership plunge with another architect before we both went our separate ways and just stayed on my own since then.
Fabulous. Your style is often described as drawing on classical, regional, and contemporary influences as well, and that's to create a sophisticated sense of place. What does sense of place mean to you, and how do you design for it, especially in eclectic cities like Los Angeles that has so many different styles?
Yeah, LA has a very rich history, and it's quite diverse. People coming from all different locations with whatever imagery they had, from their backgrounds, uniting with some of the traditions of the general California region. And a sense of place to me speaks about a building, a work of architecture that relates to the history of its environment, the people that were involved with those kinds of projects. Obviously, commissioning a private residence is a privilege in a way, and it's an unusual ability in life. And the buildings, to me, have to have some grounding in traditions in the area, whether recent, new, or historical. They're all there. We see them every day when we're moving about our cities. And so there's that kind of interplay with history and heritage, but then how is that adapted to the client, the new program, today, which is a very complicated time. And at one time there might have been fewer people making decisions and more conformity than there is now. But that all plays into sort of the end product as well.
So likewise, your firm has built luxury residences, all over the world. I'm curious how different cultures or environments. I think you've done projects in China and Singapore, and versus projects in obviously a lot of work in Southern California. How do those different cultures influence your design process? Do you bring ideas from abroad back to LA, or vice versa?
Well, I think there's a synthesis of the project in its location that is both tied to obviously the objectives of the client, and in some ways affluent clients are similar in many ways because they're world travelers and they go around in the same circles. So they often have sometimes similar lifestyles, even though the project may be in a completely unusual location like Shanghai for us. But you're dealing with perspectives of that area, the client's wishes and dreams, and how they reflect that culture. And in China, for example, there is a certain emphasis upon a large house for a successful person having a European inspiration. That's not necessarily true everywhere. So they can be tied to that specific location and ideology. And then there are traditions that might be local and more unusual. For example, in a lot of Southeast Asia, there are principles about design and openness and closure in houses related to feng shui principles, which were more about movement and visibility and energy flows through houses. In the modern era, that might translate to what do you get to see when you come in? Is everything revealed? Can energy move in and out of the house easily or not? That reflects upon the owners. Often when we travel, we absorb traditions and design themes or products and workmanship that are unique to certain areas. So, for example, a lot of the interesting plaster work of Italy can come into our projects here in California and work within kind of a loose, Mediterranean influence style. There might be tile work from Morocco or even carved plasterwork from Morocco that could come into play as well. We're working on a house in Hawaii that has that inspiration because it's meaningful for our client. So I think it's a little bit of a union of those two aspects. What influences you when you travel and you bring back and you see relevant, and then what there influences that client who also travels and has been around the world as well.
You mentioned traditional styles, and I know you're very active in preservation and classical architecture, certainly through organizations like the ICAA, National Trust, and others. How does that commitment to historic architecture influence the way you approach new design and rebuilding?
Well, I think there's a lot to be learned from just historical architecture in general, and I'm sort of including every period in that, from antiquity to, say, recent modernism or recent classicism. And there are, buildings that teach you about proportion and order and detail. They may have solved problems or provide solutions to things that are relevant to your particular project. And there's a heritage through that, as well as they might have taught you how things get adapted over time and through the ages, even if they're, quote unquote, classical or vernacular in background, as well as modern work, which we consider, and we use kind of modern and contemporary words to describe something recent. But modernism goes back quite some time already in our history. And so that becomes also, a foundation for inspiration. So I think that the classicism is really about the establishment of rules and orders and foundations that then can be adapted to new work and inform new work, and has a long and rich and quite varied history when you look at it in detail. It's not at all a uniform progression. And so I think that we combine that in our work, and we look at all of history and its meaning, because it's conveying images to people as well, and it's speaking for them and what they want to present as themselves.
That's wonderful. I sort of back to what you were saying about those influences from different countries and different styles. I know your team says it oversees every stage of a project from concept through to construction. Why is that hands-on collaborative process so important to you, and how does that affect the final home?
I think for a couple of major reasons. One is every one of these houses is a big collaboration of many people. There could be, on a very large house, ultimately hundreds and hundreds of people that work on some aspect of it and affect its outcome. And that teamwork needs to be working together, obviously, as a team with a common goal. And second is these are individual creations, and they can be highly personal and unique. And these are not off-the-shelf things in a way, even if they're influenced by historical styles. They're very detailed, complicated collaborations, and they have a lot of artistry and technology in them, and you're relying upon so many people to make that happen in the end. So it's very important for us. The architect, in a way, is the conductor, like of a symphony, and we're aware and knowledgeable to some extent about everything going on, and so we're sort of the team organizer to a degree. And as part of that, it's our role to ensure that the built house meets both our expectation and that of our client with this big team. So that's why we really pay attention to all aspects of the work as we're going along, because we're both the conductor, designer of a fair amount of it, but also working with so many different people who are all contributing and need to be in harmony.
It's what you're describing with the hundreds of people involved. You're almost talking about a concert orchestra size of team that you're actually having to conduct there. Where do you find some of those biggest challenges with that coordination?
Well, the challenges can be obviously multifaceted. You're dealing with everything from governmental approvals and agencies to clients perhaps changing their mind periodically, or not necessarily envisioning the same thing that the design team envisions and wants to make edits to a project and customize it. Sometimes you might have something as atypical as a pandemic, or a sort of a governmental interference with whatever might be needed for your product. That could delay things. There's not again, things not being so off the shelf means that time frames are highly variable. You start off with a schedule and you hope to be close to it, but it is complicated with things being so customized. Even with technology, the technology sometimes changes during the course of the project if it's a 5 or 6 year start to finish house, and you have to make adaptations along the way. So there can be a lot of monkey wrenches thrown into the process.
Yeah.
And the most important thing is just keeping making decisions as much ahead of time as can be made to keep as close to on track as possible. and try to foresee, situations that might be coming up or arising, and clear communication.
Managing client expectations, I'm sure.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Clients have access to more information and imagery and ideas than they had in the past. And that is a big factor, making sure that we don't get too sidetracked in our processes.
We certainly find that from a technology perspective. We know that, the client, back when, DSI was formed, decades ago, the understanding of technology was so different to what it is now. So that's another example of how, the homeowner has evolved, and in a way we've sort of had to adapt with it, Often it's the homeowners, children that are actually the ones that are actually sort of guiding some of the decisions when it comes to technology. It's really interesting.
That's not unlike an architectural firm.
Yeah, okay. I'm glad we're not alone there then. So in terms of, as we look at the Palisades, and I guess this is not just about the Palisades, but as we think of architecture in LA, and it's often associated with modernist and cutting edge architecture, perhaps sort of future architecture, architectural design. Given the classical approach, how do you see the future of the architecture evolving? As we look at the Palisades, obviously 3,000 empty, lots. How do we ensure that new classical work, is part of the city's evolving landscape, and it's not just all modernist?
Right. Well, I think you sort of pose a broader question, or in many ways, it's how do any of the clients or people commissioning work select what they're going to build, or what is their goal aesthetically, which is a very complicated topic in and of itself. And so I think there's a couple of factors involved. One, I think LA's history is pretty rich in many ways. It has a modern streak, but it also has a streak of history going back to the Mission style, the Victorian area, Mediterranean revival. There's a lot of houses and styles that people have brought from their experiences and in other locations. I don't think that's ever changed in a way. I mean, sometimes there are economic times that move things in one direction or another. After World War II, there was a tremendous modern movement, and in many ways it might have been because it was more economical. But then, as things change, eclecticism comes back and styles reemerge, and these things speak to people differently. So I don't think that's ever going to really change. And in some ways, LA may not be that much different than Dallas or suburban Chicago or suburban New York, where all of those, ideas are common. But the Palisades itself was a very unusual area. It was very neighborhoody. It was a little bit isolated because of access. There aren't a lot of major ways in and out of the Palisades, almost really one to some degree with a few side streets. And so it created like this little enclave. And a lot of the houses were smaller scale and 40s and 50s and colonial ranches, et cetera. So, I mean, there's going to be that history of the Palisades area that's going to maybe influence some of what moves forward, along with this broader history of LA architecture coming in. And everyone's going to bring their own impression of it, assuming there are no regulations about what can or can't be built, aesthetically, which I don't think there will be. That's not really an LA tradition. But I think it's going to be complicated in that regard. It's going to be what people bring to it, what they remember from what was there, and then this big, broad, endlessly eclectic LA past that keeps you informed. And just from the people that have contacted us, the aesthetic ranges are pretty varied as well. A lot of it's just, and then thinking about what they would want to do now if they can ignore the fire, and what they would build for themselves or their family. And I think then that's not that different than if you just happen to be building a house somewhere else. So you're gonna get all that together.
So while it comes with certainly differences, there's also the opportunity for it to be almost reborn as a completely different feeling neighborhood, right?
Yes, yes. We have the chance now to think, well, what didn't work or what was problematic in a particular neighborhood like that? Were the people who worked in the area and helped service it able to live near the area or anywhere nearby? That becomes very problematic in LA in general because there are big pockets of affluence and then people coming to work in restaurants and markets and offices in those locations. So it allows us to try to reimagine, what a suburb might be like when we have to rebuild it from scratch and think about housing access, think about public space, gatherings. What's a neighborhood about? Mm-hmm. Is there some shared experience and a vision that everyone likes? I mean, even in places that are highly individualistic and independent, there's always a certain amount of community and shared experience that we all know we have and want to promote. And in LA, I think that's more gathering spots and public spaces. And then if the area is so highly dependent on the automobile, how is that accommodated? How is that dealt with? We realize the Palisades is not going to be urban like downtown Los Angeles, nor should it be. But how is it going to be a suburb of today or a semi-urban spot of today? We have to think about because we have this chance now. And you rarely get that opportunity. Usually things just kind of evolve slowly, morph, and then get denser, and then suddenly you realize, oh, that's what I have. Now you have a whole segment. Your knuckle is gone. How do you rebuild it?
And I love that. I mean, what role do you think architects and designers can play in that, in terms of ensuring that conversation happens? Talking about, you mentioned so many things there in terms of a gathering place, in terms of, you mentioned infrastructure as well, the road in and out. How can architects and designers take a position, take a leadership role in ensuring those conversations happen?
Well, certainly, one could be working with the city and the community as to, what standards might be applied to development. We all want people to rebuild and have their homes and their lives back as fast as they can, but we don't want that to create a new environment that no one likes, or say we rushed through this and look what happened. And so I think maybe establishing certain standards about the zoning, the density, what might make sense in that area, and what is the scale of the space. Because too often we see if there's minimal regulation or not sensitive regulation, you can end up with this odd assemblage in LA of kind of like semi-urban townhouses that don't seem to quite work as townhouses, but don't certainly work as single-family houses. How do we want to achieve a comfortable scale? A lot of the trees are gone, and those have given us shade and privacy, and they're not going to be like that for decades again. Right. And so, how do we achieve that balance of public and private sort of existence that residential work embodies, and how dense do we want to make it? Is it just returning to the lots again? Is it more concentrated along Sunset Boulevard as a place to provide more multifamily housing and mixed use space? Which makes, seems to make sense along a major boulevard. And then do we have enough services? When are we going to have them? I think it's quite complicated, but the architects, I think, and designers can play a role in helping shape that, informing the public, being involved with governance, Setting examples is often one way to do it as well,
Sure.
in what you create, and keeping in touch with the community is important.
How's your firm also looked at, resilience in terms of your designs? One of the things of being in the design and build industry in the city is, it's unfortunately, the Palisades is not the first time there's been, devastating fires. There's been fires in Malibu, there's been fires in other areas, and it's something we have to contend with. When you look at rebuilding, how are the things that with the design or with the landscaping, that can be learned, that can be done differently in a fire-prone area that you've looked at?
Absolutely. We've worked on a number of houses that are in these not remote suburban areas, but where they're a little bit removed from the density of a gridded core. And we know that that's where fire is a problem here. The way the Santa Ana winds work, and it's no mystery. But at the same time, people like to live there is an issue too. So I think there's a couple of ways to think about it. One of the materials, are they fire resistant? Do they make sense for the location that they're in? Because we know that this is likely to continue on some level, regardless of our work. Two is the landscape around it being as resistant to spreading fire as possible. And sometimes that's looking at what grows here natively and how dense is it and how close is it to the residents. We know about keeping vegetation, a little bit further away from structures and not creating a foreign garden that's highly flammable and fire inviting. Right. We may have to think about how the utilities work better in these areas, because there seem to be a lot of fires caused by down power lines. And I think we're going to have to rethink how that power is provided. That may just mean underground, but it certainly exists all over the city and not just in this location. And then how much are we willing to develop, build, and pay for with public money in some of the more difficult hillside neighborhoods where there's minimal access in and out. There's always going to be a bit of a problem should some disaster happen. When you look back at the history of LA, people didn't really live way up into the hills until much later on in time. It was unnecessary, but we see what it's cost as well. So I think we do have to think about that in the long run. And there's lots of materials that are available. We don't need to build necessarily concrete bunkers, right? But they're highly flammable things. Need to be avoided as much as possible.
And when you sort of manage homeowners with clients, if they've lost a home, if they've lost a beloved or historic home, how do you honor its memory in a new design, and how do you balance preserving what residents loved about the old homes with implementing, a new design, new safety standards, things that maybe have to be a little bit different? I'd love to hear how you approach that.
Yeah, that is a fun process, and it's very it's a little bit complicated, but at the same time, one uses the opportunity to reimagine the house. One is it can evoke the charm and quality of the original. Unfortunately, many of the original houses and much residential architecture from 1880 to 1930 does have a lot of wood elements, and it doesn't mean that you can't have wood on a house. It's just it has to be kept to certain locations. I think you have to look at it as a chance to recreate it for today. not just, most of the time it's the charm and the imagery that you liked about that house. It wasn't necessarily the way everything functioned or everything operated. And so it allows you then to say, what did I love about it? What were the materials, the colors, the gardens, the feel, and then how do I work within this new environment to reimagine it? It doesn't mean it has to be a carbon copy, and it doesn't need to be, because you're also different now that you've gone through this experience, and it allows you to reimagine that for yourself and your family and your life, and how that could be made anew, but also maybe a bit different because you've probably changed a little bit in the process. And so I think you make a list of these things. What did I love about it? What I did not like about it? What would I change now that I have this interesting opportunity? And then, make that work within the new framework of what you now know. That, where you're living in a bit of a different environment, and, you have to adapt. Like every entity does.
It's a wonderfully optimistic view. I love that. It's a great way of looking at it, and so I'm kind of interested. Has your perspective of what it means to be an architect in this city, has it changed at all? Because in light of the fires, certainly the emotional impact. Having to rebuild people's homes after this trauma, and is it more motivating to stay engaged with them, or is there is it an additional requirement now to being an architect, that there is this comforter, this need to be able to kind of guide? It's no longer just building a space for a client. It's dealing with a lot of things, a lot of emotional baggage that may come with it.
Well, I think that having done almost nothing but private residences in my 40 years of working in the profession, that was good training just in general, because a residence is a much more emotional product on every level than a commercial endeavor in architecture. And that has helped, because in some ways as residential architects, we've always done that. We just have a sort of different circumstance in this case. But you're often dealing with people moving from one location to another, moving a family or building a new life, and so you're getting that emotional side. But at the same time, I think that seeing just such destruction quickly, thousands of people having to leave immediately, the kind of natural disaster you don't experience on a regular basis, you understand probably more than ever the importance of community and home, because you'll often have a house burned down, or some house fall apart, or something just happen, or a flood. But rarely do you get some epic scale events all the time, and so you do get re-imbued with the importance of civic responsibility, and again, neighborhood, and shared experience, and working together to create something. And society is just kind of a macrocosm of that, but you're getting this component of it where you're now a big part of that. You're not just designing for one person, you're like in a new frontier to some degree. And so it's an opportunity to shape the area, the neighborhood, help work with a family that has lost a lot. But again, I think it just really reinforces your sense of civic involvement that sometimes gets you're distracted from it because you're so busy doing other things, like just trying to design something, run something. You don't realize the bigger part that it all plays. And it's kind of fun designing houses because they're sort of like progeny in a way. They'll outlast you, and they're kind of something you leave in the environment. But this is sort of more unusual in that it's a whole neighborhood that's suddenly envisioned from scratch, and that's a rare opportunity, but comes with a lot of responsibility.
And and on that, in terms of that responsibility, what lessons do you think we should take from this experience, and how can, I know you've touched on some of these elements when it comes to community. How can design, planning, and community values evolve so neighborhoods emerge much stronger and more resilient after these fires, both I guess from a literal and metaphorical perspective?
Well, I think what we have to ask ourselves is, what kind of community do we want? This is a smaller version of what kind of country do you want, or state or city as a whole, but the community is that smaller part of it, and that's part of this greater whole. And when you have the opportunity to, reimagine it, it's what do you want it to be? And you really have to ask that of yourself. And you're not going to get one answer, obviously, and the same answer from every single person. But I think you're going to get a certain sense of looking at what worked and what didn't work, or what could be made better. And as architects, we're always doing that. The funniest thing about when I visit a house I've finished, I overlook everything I think I did well, and I only focus on the things I would not do the same way again, and I would change. And so I think that in the community, you might do the same thing in a way. Look at, well, it evolved and it kind of just morphed into that through decades, but we didn't realize Los Angeles was going to be Queens, New York, spread out over the state of Rhode Island now, and how would we have done things differently? We're trying to bring train systems back in where they had been obliterated, decades ago. And so I think this is that opportunity to really think, what do you want a community to be about? And, who participates, who gets to be there, and knowing that it takes all different people to make it function.
Right.
And so I think that's really, really important. And as architects, in a way, a lot of the built environment, it's the only art you can't escape. Yeah. You don't have to look at paintings. You don't have to look at sculptures unless they're in a public space. You don't have to listen to music necessarily, but you have to look at buildings and that everyone else has created in a way that sort of has a little bit of a civic responsibility there. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's something we have to ask ourselves, what do we want the Palisades to be in the 21st century now?
That's wonderful. Thank you, Richard. That was a really insightful conversation. Some wonderful thoughts there that you've shared, and perspectives. We really appreciate you coming in and stopping by and joining our podcast. Do you have any sort of closing remarks? Any kind of thoughts on how the LA construction industry, design construction industry right now, how things are faring beyond the Palisades that you'd like to share?
Well, we obviously, this is just one thing happening in Los Angeles. We have a lot going on.
That's for sure.
As any major city does. I do encourage people to try to engage as much as they can with their neighborhoods and their governance to help shape their environment and in ways, because even if your neighborhood's completely intact, there's a lot of aspects to it that could be improved, but take a lot of civic endeavor. It's not going to be done by governance by itself, and it's not going to be done by a few individuals. And I think this can often, offer the opportunity to maybe for people to get a bit more engaged in their own areas and how they can make them better and organize as well. Because it's a city of neighborhoods, maybe hundreds of them in a way.
Sure.
But we all have to be a part of it. And I think that this fire can offer that opportunity to just rethink again about a bit more civic mindedness that really is important to have, and especially when cities get as complicated and involved as we have here.
Thank you. I actually have another question. When you look at maybe the next sort of generation of architects coming through, do you still see the interest in architecture from a younger generation, still that steady stream of the next generation of architects coming through from architecture school? Is that something that is of concern in some ways? I mean, we know in construction industries, for example, there are enormous shortages in the skilled trades, and when it comes to the Palisades, that could certainly have some impact further down the line. But I'm curious, in terms of the field of architecture and design, are there any concerns around workforce shortages in that regard?
Well, architecture is a very complicated profession
And a very lengthy one to learn.
It involves knowing a lot of different disciplines that are related, but we don't think of having to be so aware of. And so I think that, when I look back at school, it can, I think that it's fun and interesting, but that complexity needs to be conveyed in academia, so people understand what's really involved in doing it. I mean, with construction and trades, I mean, I think we do need a much broader kind of educational process that foments people going into these areas. And that was not uncommon when I was in school way back, but I don't know if that's quite the case today. We do need a lot of people doing different things. Everyone can't be coders and and computer technicians and
not so much anymore, maybe.
Well, even less so. Yeah, but I mean, architecture is a very creative endeavor. It involves, again, lots of interesting aspects to it. There are many people in schools who are really interested in it. But I think offices and organizations need to kind of foster that a bit more. The ICAA, for example, in traditional work, does a great job of trying to engage younger people through their Young Classicists program. And so I think that across the industry would be a good target to make sure that is something we keep an eye on. And even having interns and younger people come into offices is very helpful to kind of create that connection between work and education and the real environment that's out there. And certainly governance can play a role in this as well. The profession is adapting just like every other.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. I thought I'd put that question in as well. Just I'm always fascinated with workforce development. It's a personal passion of mine. I'm always sort of thinking about what the next generation and whether there is enough, interest, because I think what we do is amazing. I mean, we working in luxury residential it's a fabulous area to be in. The creativity, as you said, that we have, and the homeowners as well that we have to deal with, and I just think it's an area that I think more people should be aware of, and so I just thought I'd throw that in at the end. but thank you ever so much, Richard. I really appreciate you taking the time to come in. It was a great conversation.
Thank you. I appreciate your having me and doing this for our community.